So our second speaker of this session then, who was actually supposed to be the third speaker, is Corey Andrews, who is a second-year research master's student at the Center for Hermetic Philosophy and Related Currents at the University of Amsterdam. Corey's current research focuses on the intellectual history and symbolism of Rosicrucianism as it relates to the theme of Pansophia in 17th century Europe. And the title of Corey's paper is Transformation as Process, the Reflexive Universe of Arthur M. Young. Go ahead, Corey.
Thank you, Dr. White, for the introduction. Sorry. And then,
is this your presentation?
Yes. Great, thanks. Thanks, Faith, Misha, the technicians, for being here, everybody online. So this transformation as process, the reflexive universe of Arthur M. Young. For some reason, not all of it is visible. Anyway, yeah, the subtitle is the reflexive universe of Arthur M. Young. This has been a fun parallel project to my thesis research that I hope to publish something on. It's a bit of a tentative step into the reflexive universe. So who is Arthur Young? These are his words. I remember looking out of the airplane window as a child and watching the birds. And I always thought, wouldn't it be nice to be a bird? Until I realized the bird is always trying to get somewhere. And you don't get anywhere by flying any better than getting there some other way. The thing is to be where you are, to be free without having to go somewhere else. You might say to live in the moment. The real freedom is right here now, not to get somewhere else where you begin to be free. The aim of my presentation is to talk about the life and philosophy of Arthur M. Young. The short story here is that Arthur invented the helicopter and a cosmological theory of process. The version of the story I'll be telling, however, involves looking into the process that resulted in his invention, and secondly, his exploration and synthesis of esoteric doctrines in the second half of his life, which culminated in his theory of process. Arthur was a precocious child who grew up and spent his later youth in rural Pennsylvania on his father's farm. In the late 1920s, he began his undergraduate studies at the mathematics department at Princeton, where he started daydreaming about inventing something. While at Princeton, he had a number of what he called armchair ideas. But the helicopter seemed like a good idea to him because it would, quote, take quite a long time. This seems like backwards thinking, he says, but he had been familiar with radio technology, and he would have an idea about it, and then he would read about it the next month in a magazine. The helicopter, he reflected later on, was a good choice because it took him 10 years before he even got the idea really going. Arthur stated in an interview that the dream of the helicopter was a dream of releasing the self from various restraints. He explains that he took up the task of designing a helicopter as a way to train himself in the world of practical problems, as a way to test his theories against objective fact. The helicopter was my encounter with reality. What were the laws and how do you fit them together? He began working on the problem of rotary wing flight in 1929. Working independently, Young spent 12 solitary years testing and perfecting small aerodynamic models on his father's farm. His focus with the aerodynamic models was in the area of stability. This was one of the early prototypes which Young experimented with rotary wing flight. The rotors he is folding down are inert with smaller rotors at the end of each of them. This model was the first to achieve any lift in his rubber band models, and so he manufactured this version to test it out on a larger scale. It achieved lift, but it was utterly uncontrollable once any lift was achieved. It would rapidly vacillate to one side, and then more extremely to the other side, and then would finally flip over and crash. 9 years later in his barn, this was the prototype he was working with. He was able to get it to sustain lift for a longer period of time and at a greater height, but this too vacillated too extremely, as you can make out with this image of it toppling over in mid-flight. So the issue was stability. These are stills from video footage. Arthur was diligent in video documenting every significant test flight of a model, and many of them have found their way onto YouTube. In December of 1939, Arthur made his breakthrough on stable flight in this model, which included the first version of the stabilizer bar. It was model number 7, which first included the bar, which finally achieved stable flight. Young explains, the bar controls the rotor and keeps it independent of the oscillations of the machine, providing the helicopter with an artificial horizon. You can even rock the fuselage, and the thing will just remain still in the air, as he puts it, as if it's suspended from heaven. This was Arthur's solution to stable flight. In this image, you can see his hand. He's ripping it away after pushing it to demonstrate the stability. It would just rock and then just settle. He eventually applied enough redundancy to make the bar into a flywheel that achieves increased stability without the excess weight. This is him in his later years recollecting on the matter. And with this model, he went to Buffalo, New York in 1941 to show it to Larry Bell of the Bell Aircraft Company, who he had met through a mutual friend. Larry Bell was instantly fascinated, not only with the model, but also with Arthur Young. Arthur's helicopter was a tremendous success. This was the world's first commercially licensed helicopter. For 30 years, it was the most widely used rotary wing craft in the world. This is a still from an image of a full-scale model of him also pushing it to demonstrate the stability. These are on YouTube and really something to watch. By October 1947, after 18 years of developing the helicopter, his work at Bell was complete. But for Arthur, the helicopter was just the beginning. Having sold his designs to Bell and being now financially independent, he then began to apply what he had learned in the process of invention and mathematics to problems of cosmology. With this decision, he was following a trajectory similar to that of the American philosopher Alfred North Whitehead at Harvard, who was also a mathematician before he developed his own process philosophy. In the years since the helicopter was completed, as a culmination of his research into philosophy, metaphysics, and esotericism, Young worked out a systematic theory of process, a theory that includes purpose as a formal ingredient. Many philosophers, Young states, refer to man as a machine, by which they intend to imply that he doesn't have a purpose. Nothing could be more false, because there never was a machine that didn't have a purpose. In fact, I wonder if there ever was a purpose that doesn't need a machine to carry it out. It's that wedding of purpose and machinery that makes the world. At home equally in astrology as he was in quantum physics, for Arthur, mythos and logos comprise one seamless whole. His first pansophic combination of his scientific and esoteric studies were compiled into his first book published in 1976. It was called The Geometry of Meaning. The aphorism which inspired this text, Young recalled being attributed to ancient Egypt in "all meaning is an angle." We'll return to this idea. 4 years after submitting his design to Bell, in his private journal, which was eventually published as The Bell Notes, A Journey from Physics to Metaphysics, Young indicates his growing interest in esotericism. In a note dated October 11, 1945, Arthur writes, "The vista of emptiness which faced me when I turned away from the helicopter, when I looked at my old books and tried to pick up the threads of that earlier period, the emptiness, and with it the melancholy, bitter turning away from life, I was not afraid, but worried. Not that I mind this emptiness, I want it and am willing to pay any price, because I think it is a higher use of the privilege of being alive. Worried because maybe to do an about-face with destiny, to take on the monk's robe now, that I embrace ineffectuality. For the thought that stabbed most deeply said, thoughts must produce things, and what thing is there? Who wants a theory of art? Of what use is it? That which is without application, without effect, without utility, without embodiment, is without existence. And yet, my Faustus yearning seeks a new mathematic. With all this, I wish for something, and I know I wish. I'd like to reach up into some unknown upper air, mix numbers there, and obtain flashes from chemicals, clashes from unheard symbols, but jam-jams and symbols, mixtures and hymnals squeeze out of my mind. What could I do? The esoteric sword is in my belt and I use it every day. I reach up and pull rabbits from thin air daily for an audience of trained seals who stand amazed. Now I want only to amaze myself. I want to retire and seek the esoteric for its own sake." The path Arthur then chose led away from conventional determinism. Among the many influences during this period are the 17th century German shoemaker and mystic Jakob Böhme, of whom Arthur commented in a note dated October 6, 1946 that, "A little Böhme goes straight to the head. He speaks of the unspeakable and gives answers to the unanswerable." Additional influences include the theosophical doctrines of Madame H.P. Blavatsky. Also Charles Fort, the American critic of science who gleefully compiled data which confounded orthodoxy. The Swiss theorist of the unconscious Carl Jung, who Arthur described as a great man and one of the great minds of our time. Also Rosicrucianism, and the anonymous medieval author of The Cloud of Unknowing, which Jung thought was one of the most profound writings ever to come out of the West. It's not really my theory, it's the theory that the ancients had all along, and I've just made a correlation with modern science. Arthur's theory of process is a formal analytical tool, devised to answer questions normally considered outside the scope of scientific inquiry. It is a system having its own mathematical rigor with a basis in number theory, physics, and biology. He does, however, challenge the materialist assumptions of the sciences, the belief that everything can be explained on the basis of physical interaction. Jung formally presented his theory in his second book, also published in 1976. It was called The Reflexive Universe. In this work, he provides the main postulates of the theory of process. The universe is a process put in motion by purpose. The development of process occurs in stages. there are 7 stages. Each stage develops a new power. Powers are cumulative. Each one retains the powers developed in the previous stages. Powers are evolved in what are called kingdoms. Jung's fascination with the number 7 for his theory began when he started investigating ancient mythologies, in particular those which address cosmogony, or how the universe came into being. In many of these accounts, process is described as occurring in 7 stages. Jung writes, "This is true of Genesis, in which God makes the universe in 6 days and rests on the 7th. Also in the Zoroastrian, Japanese, and Hindu accounts." Quoting Jung, "Not all traditions explicitly state that there are 7 stages, but by noting correspondences," Arthur states, "we can find the implication of 7 stages in yet other myths, for example, the Greek myth of Kronos. In any case, I now had a hint, perhaps a directive, that process involves 7 stages." This is the schematic which Jung created to visualize the evolutionary stages of cosmological process. It consists of 7 stages arranged on 4 levels or stories. They include light, nuclear particles, atoms, molecules, plants, animals, and a 7th, as yet unnamed, of which man, or humans, would be the current manifestation. Furthermore, the arc is arranged on 4 levels. This 4-fold division he correlates with the Babylonian and Egyptian descriptions of man, as well as those of Carl Jung and others. A crucial feature in this model is what he calls the turn, represented on the arc as a right angle. All meaning is an angle. This turn marks the point where involution, the descent of light into matter, changes to evolution. The turn is the origin of life, where the beginning of energy or information storage makes possible the first cellular organisms. In terms of mythology, Arthur thinks this turn finds expression as rebirth, or the birth of the hero. This is cited as a virgin birth, one without cause. Arthur asserts that in each stage after the turn, a new degree of freedom is attained by the organism and the ability to use laws rather than be used by them. To Jung, this is exemplified in the principle of inference. Jung understands inference as a reversal of cause and effect. To explain this, he uses the example of cooking. It is the cooking as a goal which is what causes us to make a fire. In other words, we as humans reverse cause and effect. And I think this is the central, most important thing about Arthur's theory, is that he's put consciousness in as a dimensionality, the capacity to reverse time. It doesn't mean that everything goes backwards the way it does when you reverse a film, but you are, in your imagination, reversing time when you think about how to do something. Organizational thinking thus takes place in an inverted time sense. In his books, as well as in his seminars, a central concept in his theory was the torus. This is a torus. Now the torus shape, I'm quoting Jung here, which is also that of a vortex, occurs widely in nature. It is the shape of a magnetic field, of a tornado, and of eddies or whirlpools in water. And especially interesting, he writes, is the fact that it is the only manner by which self-sustained motion can exist in a given medium. It is a unique manifestation of air in air, a tornado, or of water in water, a whirlpool or an eddy. Jung was convinced that this was not only the shape of the universe, upon which he depicts the 7 stages of process in different colors, but also that it predicted 3 space dimensions to 1 time dimension. And so the shape of the ring of the torus is all of space, and this is the time wrapping it up. As Arthur puts it, and so it's the time to wrap it all up. That's what the universe is. And for me, it's also time to wrap it up. I'd like to close with an excerpt from a lecture Arthur gave at one of his seminars where he illustrates his fascination with the number 7 by recounting a Rosicrucian story. Rosicrucianism is one of the main collection areas in the library here, so I thought I would close with it. He starts by drawing a series of 7 circles on the chalkboard in this shape, and I'll now quote him. "I've always been interested in 7s, and this is maybe the most obvious of 7s, because there's something in saying that if you make 6, you get the 7th gratis. Like on the 7th day God rested. The 7th comes out of what has been done. There's no further physical addition needed." Suddenly a student interjects, commenting on the connection between this idea and the structure of musical notation. Arthur takes the student's point and then proceeds further by referencing an alchemical story he once read called The Chemical Wedding. Here Arthur is referring to the 3rd Rosicrucian Manifesto, and so what follows is Arthur's reading of the story. I honestly don't know what to make of it. It begins with a scholar who is studying in his house when an angel with wings covered in the eyes of peacocks appears, offering him an engraved invitation to a wedding. And he goes to the wedding, which turns out to be an initiation procedure that takes place in 7 towers. And each tower has 7 stories. And as each initiate graduates each rite, they graduate to a higher story. Some of them don't pass and are taken out. But our hero, by the dint of great effort, gets to the 6th stage. But then someone comes and taps him on the shoulder and says, "You're finished now." And so he's very depressed for failing at the 6th stage. And then they take him up to the 7th story, and he's permitted to look down through an oculus. and see the other initiates struggling with their initiations. But the last one is gratis, the extra thing. He didn't even know he was going to get it. In any case, I always resisted to use this as a case of sevens. It was too simplistic, the 7 circles, because it could only be done on a surface. It wasn't true in a volume or a higher dimension. In a volume, it's 12 spheres around one. And so there was no particular significance about this. But then I realized this is significant, even though it's a surface, because all analysis is a surface. So we look at the world as sevenfold because it's an analytical view. And I'm afraid that's all you can do. You can't have analysis in anything other than a superficial way. In other words, if you were to go into it deeper, you would go into it by participating in it. You jump in the water and start swimming instead of looking at it. And that's what the highest stages of evolution do. After you're finished with the mind, it literally means that. You throw it away. You proceed from an inner source, and the mystery of that eludes me, and I don't think it can ever be transmitted. It's something you'd have to gain yourself. Arthur died of cancer in 1995 at the age of 89 in his home in Berkeley, California. His theory of process has since been described as a New Age religion and a New Age science. The British author of esotericism, Colin Wilson, called Jung's theory one of the most remarkable and constructive attempts to rebuild science in our own time. With his theory of process, Arthur's Faustus yearning had sought and found a new mathematic. According to Arthur, king of the helicopter, the problem is that our vocabulary is not yet developed to deal with something that's both religion and science. And I think I agree with him. Arthur always thought, wouldn't it be nice to be a bird? Until he realized the bird is always trying to get somewhere. The thing is to be where you are, to be free without having to go somewhere else. You might say to live in the moment. Thank you.